The Jets make it official. Aaron Rodgers will not return to the team in 2025. I think it's a move that had to be made. I'll explain why and discuss the other implications of this decision today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Friday, February 14th, 2025. Happy Valentine's Day to you. I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Well, the Jets made it official yesterday. They put out a statement and said that Aaron Rodgers is not returning to the team in 2025. Of course, this was originally reported on Super Bowl Sunday by Jay Glazer, but the Jets have officially acknowledged it. There are so many angles to discuss when we talk about this decision. And I'll start off by saying, I think this was a move the Jets had to make. I think this was the right direction for the team. I think that this was the best decision for all parties involved, and that includes Rodgers. And from the Jets standpoint, I think there are just a lot of different angles for this. And I think like if you don't like one reason for the decision, there are a number of others, because I think all signs pointed to the Jets moving on from Rodgers being the right move from them. I mean, we can start by talking about the most tangible aspects of this. First of all, is that Rodgers is just nowhere near the quarterback he was in Green Bay. He's better than Zach Wilson. He's better than a lot of other Jets quarterbacks, but the bar cannot be that low. With the Jets, we can't just say better than Zach Wilson or better than rookie Sam Darnold is good enough. We need to have higher standards. And Aaron Rodgers last year came nowhere near playing at the level that he did in Green Bay, where he established himself as a living legend. We saw a player who was nowhere close to the four-time MVP, and he was set to come back at a salary cap number of $37.5 million. I think it's tough to bring back a 41-year-old who's that expensive in a situation where you have no realistic path to the Super Bowl. Jets really needed to turn the page. And there's also symbolism behind it. The last 2 years, everything's been built around Aaron Rodgers. Everything. The coaching staff has been built around Aaron Rodgers. Nathaniel Hackett was the offensive coordinator because of Aaron Rodgers. In many ways, Robert Saleh kept his job after 2023 because of Aaron Rodgers. I think you could say the same thing about the general manager, Joe Douglas. Players like Alan Lazard and Devontae Adams were brought in because of Aaron Rodgers. And it's all well and good to say, Rodgers can come back and, he just won't have the same authority over the team. We'll just bring back Rodgers, the player. It's much more difficult to execute in practice. And we saw that to a degree this week when the report came out that the Jets had certain asks of Aaron Rodgers. And those asks were symbolic from the standpoint that they were the types of things that suggested that Rodgers was no longer the most important guy on the team. Not doing Pat McAfee's show, making sure he's there at all the mandatory offseason practices. At the end of the day, did Rodgers appearing on Pat McAfee's show win or lose games for the team? Of course not. Did Rodgers skipping the mandatory part of the offseason program last year to go to Egypt really have an impact on the team going 5-12? I doubt it. But Aaron Glenn's trying to come in and establish that he's in charge. And I think that's fair for a first-time head coach. The last 2 years, the Jets have established that Aaron Rodgers was the most important player on the team, that the rules for Rodgers were different than the rules for everybody else. Aaron Glenn wants to come in and change things, and that's Aaron Glenn's prerogative. It's what Aaron Glenn should be doing. It's very difficult to ask Aaron Rodgers to do these things, to take a step back, and it's probably something Aaron Rodgers was not willing to do. I think you talk about the salary cap implications. Now, the Jets are going to be hit with a big dead money figure, but it would be even bigger if you kick the can down the road. If the Jets brought back Aaron Rodgers, they'd be looking at a dead money figure in 2026 of over $60 million. And I think if you look at the way things are lining up, 2025 is kind of setting up to be a reset year for the Jets. And when I say reset year, that doesn't mean the Jets are going to be uncompetitive necessarily. That doesn't mean we're just going to tank this season. I think anybody out there who's saying that this is going to be a season where the Jets tank, where they're the worst team in the league, is not being accurate. And I'll explain why that's true in a bit. But I think things are focused on 2026 really being the big year where this thing takes off, if all goes well. And you don't want to have all this dead money coming off the, hitting the books in 2026. That's just not really conducive. That's not really conducive to anything the Jets are trying to do. So, you can argue that Rodgers is the best, the bridge quarterback options. I actually would debate that. I don't see how, and I've talked about this on yesterday's show. I don't see a lot of difference between the current version of Rodgers. I'm not saying Rodgers' resume as a whole, because Rodgers will be a first ballot Hall of Famer, one of the top 15 quarterbacks to ever play, maybe one of the top 10 quarterbacks to ever play. He obviously has a better resume than a lot of guys, but the player he is right now, a very ordinary quarterback, and a guy who's going to be a year older. He's going to be 41, turning 42 in the season this year. There's really not much to suggest he's a special player anymore. And there's even less to suggest that, he's going to bounce back at his advanced age and have a big season. I think that this was the first test for Aaron Glenn and Darren Muji. And I think they passed it with flying colors. I think, first of all, the decision was obvious that the Jets needed to move on from Rodgers. And I know some people will disagree with that, but I think it's tough. I just think there's so much lining up against Rodgers returning and so little to argue for his returning. But beyond that, I like the way it was handled. This did not turn into the offseason drama many people were expecting, the offseason drama many people were fearing. The Jets took care of this quickly, and they did not come in with preconceived notions. It wasn't Aaron Glenn coming in, breathing fire in his introductory press conference, pounding the table, either saying Rodgers is definitely back or Rodgers is not back. He said, we're going to take some time to evaluate it. Jets took some time to evaluate it. They didn't take forever. They were not in a hurry. They took the amount of time they needed. They spoke with Rodgers. They by all accounts, they went into the meeting with Rodgers with an open mind. And they laid out what I thought were a very reasonable set of asks for Rodgers. And of course, it's Aaron Rodgers' prerogative to say no to that. As I said, as I said earlier in the week, can I get mad at Aaron Rodgers? Should anybody be mad at Aaron Rodgers that he doesn't want to accept the Jets' demands, that he doesn't want to accept canceling the McAfee show interview? No, Aaron Rodgers has a stature in this league where he doesn't owe the Jets those things. The only thing I would say is that if Aaron Rodgers agreed to those things, he should stick to them. But if he doesn't want to agree to them, he's going to be honest about that. That's fair. And I think for all parties, it's best to move on. And I think the way they, sometimes you get bad news, but you can handle bad news respectfully, or you can handle bad news disrespectfully. If you go back 10 years, the Jets handled the departures of some players pretty disrespectfully. You talk about the way DeBrickashaw Ferguson was let go, the way Nick Mangold was let go, the way David Harris was let go. I think in this case, and Rodgers doesn't have the same stature of the organization as these guys. I think the Jets handled things with Rodgers very respectfully. Maybe he didn't want to hear what they had to say. Maybe he didn't want the conditions that they had. Probably doesn't want to leave. But they've done it at a point where now he has the whole offseason to find a new team if he wants to continue his career, or he has a chance to think about, does he want to retire? The Jets did not string Rodgers along. They laid out, this is what we need. If you're willing to do these things, we could talk. If not, then we'll give you an opportunity to seek another option. And this is the type of professionalism that, quite frankly, I feel like the Jets have lacked for a long time. Now, this doesn't guarantee Glenn and Muji are going to be the most successful duo in franchise history. It is a very small first step, but it is a first step. And I think when you look at the utter chaos that's been existing in this organization for the last couple of years, especially that driven by the owner, it's a positive sign. It's a sign that we have professional people in place now. Now, that doesn't mean that the owner is not still lurking there. Of course, I have concerns about what Woody Johnson's going to do, but for the first time in a while, it feels to me like the Jets are functioning like a professional football operation, and that is an encouraging sign for me. Now, I had you on the Locked On Jets podcast. Let's talk about what Aaron Rodgers' departure means for the present. I think a lot of people are misreading what his departure is going to mean. I'll explain why, and I'll explain what I think his departure really means as we continue here on this Friday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. This Friday edition of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because with FanDuel, you can place bets through the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in on the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. FanDuel's live betting feature keeps every moment of the game exciting. Whether you're backing your team for a late-game rally or picking a player to hit a clutch three, you'll never feel like you missed your chance. Plus, the app is easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. And right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the National Basketball Association. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Yesterday, the Jets officially announced that Aaron Rodgers is not returning to the team in 2025. I guess I have to be careful with my use of the word official because the team has not officially released him yet, but the team did confirm the report from Jay Glazer from Super Bowl Sunday that they have decided to move on from Aaron Rodgers. So there will be a new quarterback in town in the year 2025. So what are the implications of this? Well, first we can talk about the salary cap implications. Jets have a choice in front of them. Now, they can either designate Rodgers a post-June 1st cut, or they can just make him a regular cut. So what does all that mean? Well, if Rodgers is a regular cut, there will be $49 million in dead money he will count against the cap in the year 2025 for the Jets. So essentially, even though Rodgers is gone, he's going to cost $49 million against the cap. And that's because the Jets deferred a lot of the cap hits. Jets paid Rodgers a lot of money, but he had low cap hits his 2 years with the team. So the rest has to be, so the bill comes due when we're talking about the salary cap because Rodgers is no longer with the team. The other option is if they make him a post-June 1st cut, then they can change that. It would be $14 million this year and $35 million next year. So think of a post-June 1st cut, you reduce his cap hit this year, but you make it $35 million next year. So you'd be 2 years removed from Aaron Rodgers being on the team, and he's still costing you $35 million against the cap. My preference here would be for the Jets to just get it all out of the way for reasons I mentioned in the first segment. Is, if 2025 is going to be a year where you're kind of resetting things, where you're unclogging your salary cap, because Rodgers is not the only player with bills coming due. The Jets have deferred a lot of cap hits to this year because they were trying to go all in last year and in 2023. So Jets have a lot of these bills due, but they can get their cap back in working order, if they just deal with things this year. So my preference would be just get it all out of the way this year. Take the $49 million cap hit, and there are other mechanics with the post June 1st designation that we don't really need to get into. The Jets would still save money. There's stuff that's not worth getting into. But the bottom line is the Jets would save money this year and put more on their cap next year if they do the post June 1st designation. I think they should just take it all this year. But when I say the Jets should view 2025 as a reset year, I think people are mistaking what that means. Just because the Jets are resetting in 2025, that doesn't mean that they should be uncompetitive. It doesn't mean they will be uncompetitive. And one thing I've noticed in certain sectors of the fan base is the notion that 2025 is not going to be a tank season because Aaron Rodgers is not here. And I think that that's a mistaken mindset. First of all, because I really think there's a section of the fan base that wildly overrates what Aaron Rodgers was last year. I mean, one of the arguments I keep hearing is, well, Rodgers was good enough. We lost all those games because of the defense and because of the kicking game. As though it can't be mutually exclusive that Rodgers was not good enough and the defense wasn't good enough and the kicking game wasn't good enough. Because, look, Greg Zuerlein was bad last year. Maybe he was dealing with an injury, but Greg Zuerlein missed some key kicks. And the defense was awful, especially after Robert Saleh was fired. But the offense wasn't good enough either. The offense scored the 24th most points in the league. And in the passing game, the Jets had the 25th highest, they were tied for the 23rd highest net yards per passing attempt. So, the kicking game was bad, but there were some games where the game would have never come down to the kick if the offense played better. You can blame everybody. There's enough blame to go around. You don't need to choose whether it's Aaron Rodgers or whether it's the defense or whether it's the kicking game. The Jets weren't a good enough team last year. And the coaching obviously was very bad. So, you shouldn't just pick one side. And I think that's really mistaken analysis. And the bottom line is that, and this is probably a good thing for the Jets, and this is something I've talked about on the show the last couple of days, Aaron Rodgers' production is actually not going to be that hard to replace because it was comparable with other veteran quarterbacks this past season. They really weren't that good. And this team does have talent, and I feel like we've swung the pendulum Like last year, we went too far in praising the talent. People, talking about the Jets as a legitimate Super Bowl contender, which we know they weren't. And I understand why people thought they were a legitimate Super Bowl contender. I mean, look, if Rodgers was like vintage Rodgers, and if Tyron Smith was vintage Tyron Smith, and Mike Williams was vintage Mike Williams, maybe we'd be having a different discussion. They weren't, though. But now people are talking about the Jets, the roster that's largely going to be this, at least as far as the key players go, a lot of the key players are going to be back. And without Rodgers, now people are talking about the Jets being like a 3-4 win team. And that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, because it's like, Sauce Gardner is going to be back and hopefully play better. Garrett Wilson's going to be back. You hope the Jets don't do anything rash with Garrett Wilson, but Jermaine Johnson will be back from injury. Breece Hall will be back. You still have Elijah Vera Tucker, still have Olu Fashion, who's going to come back and hopefully be a year better. Hopefully you do good things in the draft. There's really no reason this team can't be competitive in 2025. Now, what that means, what does competitive mean? It's tough to say, but I don't look at this team and think 4 wins is the base scenario. I mean, this was a Jets team that was 5-12. I think if we're being honest, they were a little unlucky. This was a team that probably should have won won something more like 7-8 games if they had better luck in tight games. Yet this Jets team was kind of snake bitten in close games. And look, part of it was the kicker wasn't good. Part of it was the offense wasn't good. Part of it was the defense wasn't good. But it's a team that probably should have won more than 5 games. And, look, a lot of the NFL season does come down to luck, probably more of it than we're comfortable admitting. What's your schedule look like? What injuries do you suffer? Does the ball bounce your way? Do you get a bad call that benefits you in a tight game? Does a fumble bounce your way, or does the opponent let a fumble slip out of their hands? These are things that can change a season. These are things. I mean, these are things that can swing games. And in a season where you only have 17 games, there's not a huge difference between like a 7-win team and a 10-win team. And we saw that this year again, because like the Jets went 5-12. If we're being honest, they probably should have been like more something like 7-10, 8-9. Not a great team, but not a terrible team. And I feel like that's kind of the base case scenario for this coming season, because I don't think the Jets are really going to lose anybody that's not important. The guys that they're losing were guys who were underperformers. And the Jets, look, the cap situation is going to be tight, but I don't think maybe Jamie and Sherwood, and I hope the Jets find a way to keep him. But this is a team that should be very competitive. And I think part of this goes with what the mentality you hope Aaron Glenn brings in, because if this is a good coaching staff, well, what do good coaching staffs get their teams to do? They get them to overachieve. They get them to exceed their preseason win totals. And part of me feels like the low expectations are maybe a blessing for the Jets, because the Jets have, over the last couple of years, have been the ultimate overpromise and underdeliver team. I mean, unless the Jets went to the Super Bowl, which was not, in retrospect, which was not realistic, unless the Jets had gone to the Super Bowl the last couple of years, the view would be negative on their season. Whereas this coming year, I have all these people who very difficult to understand, but they see this as a 4-win team. Well, the Jets are probably going to clear that. So the Jets have actually set themselves up with low expectations that should be pretty easy to clear. And I think a lot of people are going to end up feeling very positive about this season. And that's especially true if Aaron Glenn is half the coach we're hoping he'll be. Of course, first-time head coach, you never really know. But I think all the pieces are in place for the Jets to be a much better team than people expect this coming season. Anyway, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we've just taken a look forward as to what's to come. But let's take a look back. Let's reflect on an era which seemed to have so much promise at the beginning but went wrong. What can Jets fans take from it? I'll give you some thoughts as we continue here on this Friday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by PrizePicks. Football season may be over, but basketball is in full swing, and there's no better way to stay in the game than with PrizePicks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With PrizePicks, you just pick more or less on at least 2 player projections, and if you're right, you would get to win up to 1,000 times your cash. You can set your lineup in less than 60 seconds, and their fast and secure withdrawals mean you can get your winnings in as little as 15 minutes. Plus, you gotta love their weekly promos like Taco Tuesday, where you get discounted player projections for an even better value. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, that's code LOCKEDONNFL. It's one word with no space. LOCKEDONNFL for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks, run your game. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Friday. The Jets have announced that Aaron Rodgers will not return to the team in 2025. It comes as no surprise. This was reported by Jay Glazer before the Super Bowl this past Sunday, but it's it's notable that the Jets have now confirmed the report, and the Jets have announced that they will move on without Aaron Rodgers in 2025, the first major decision of the Aaron Glenn, Darren Muji era. And I have to say, one I agree with. I think if you're a Jets fan, though, you can't help but be a little sad that this era worked out so poorly. I mean, I don't think in anybody's imagination it could have gone this badly. Even if you were a skeptic of the trade, like I was skeptical of the trade in many ways, but I never would have guessed that Aaron Rodgers would be the quarterback of 5 Jets wins in 2 seasons. And of course, part of that was what happened in year 1 when he suffered an Achilles injury, not just the first game of the season, but on the first drive the Jets had offensively that year. I mean, you can't help but be a little sad thinking back to all the excitement. First in March 2023, when Aaron Rodgers went on the Pat McAfee show and announced that he was going to come to the Jets. And then in April, when the Jets actually pulled off the trade, being a Jets fan, I don't need to tell you this. It's not been an easy last 14 years. And there have been so few times to get excited. And how many times in the past have the Jets been the team that, the big player had no interest in coming to, but they made it seem like they were interested in coming to the Jets because they were really trying to get another team to increase its bid. The Jets have always been the team that gets used as leverage. And here you had an all-time player who wanted to come to the Jets. And what followed was an incredible electricity through the fan base, an incredible amount of excitement. The Jets became, one of the buzziest teams in the NFL. Now, as we know, as we've seen over and over through the recent history of the league, winning the offseason and having a lot of offseason buzz does not necessarily equate with success once the games start playing. But, for a fan base that's been so starved for a winner, for a fan base that's been so starved for anything positive, that was a very exciting time to be a Jets fan. Even as somebody who was kind of skeptical of the trade and didn't love everything the Jets were doing at that time. I mean, how could you not have been all in before the 2023 or 2024 seasons? But of course, there are lessons here, and I'm going to try and spin this into a positive lesson because we all know how everything went wrong. We've talked ad nauseum about why everything went wrong, and we'll probably continue to talk about why everything went wrong. But I do think there's a lesson positively that you can take from this. And that's, it starts with a negative, because it starts with talking about how, all of the buzz and all of the pomp and circumstance around this trade did not turn into wins. And it shows you again that having a lot of buzz, being focused on, being so focused on the here and now doesn't always necessarily result in success in the NFL. But the reverse of that is I think there's this perception that you're either all in now or you have to wait 5 years to win. And that's not always the case. And I know that's difficult to hear as a Jets fan because you've been waiting 14 years and you haven't seen your team win. But I think, when we talk about building a more sustainable path, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to wait a long time. The Jets made some moves to put themselves on a more sustainable path when they traded Jamal Adams to the Seattle Seahawks and got multiple first-round picks in return. The Jets put themselves on a more sustainable path when they cashed Sam Darnold in for a second-round pick, which turned into Breece Hall. If you look at that, the Jets didn't need to wait 5 years to reap the rewards of those smart moves, of those moves that brought greater sustainability. Those moves produced immediate results. And I think that there's this misconception. I hear it among the media. I hear it among other places that, it's either you're winning now, either you're making the buzzy moves that are going to help you now, or if you're focused on the future, that means, we have to wait forever. And that's not really the case. What I think is the case is that the buzzy moves don't always work, but they get you immediate excitement in the offseason. Whereas if you go down a more sustainable path, if you manage your salary cap well, if you invest in draft picks, you don't get as much excitement. There's not that jolt of electricity. But draft picks contribute immediately in this league. And if they don't contribute immediately, the good ones usually contribute by year 2. And a smart free agent signing contributes right away. DJ Reed was not the flashiest free agent signing. It wasn't the move that got the Jets the most accolades in the offseason. But from day one, he was great. So when we talk about team building, when we talk about the sound moves that smart teams make, that doesn't mean you have to wait forever to get results. It just means you don't get as much praise in the offseason. And offseason praise is very fickle because who are the teams that get praise, once we get to January, who are the teams that get praised for their offseason? They're the great teams in the league. There's the Kansas Cities. They're the Baltimores. They're the teams that really do things right. they don't get as much praise for what they do in March because they don't tend to make as moves that are as buzzy. So I guess my point here is that, when you hear the Jets talking about being more sustainable, that doesn't mean that we're like waiting 5 years to build a winning team, because the Jets can be a very competitive team as soon as 2025, as long as they have the right people in place. If the Jets make some smart moves this offseason, they make a couple of smart targeted free agent signings with what little cap space they have. If the Jets get smart in the draft, maybe trade down a couple of times, they're going to get some grief in the short run. But in the long run is not 2030. The long run is this autumn. And you combine that with good coaching, things can turn around. So just as the Jets making all these buzzy moves, and just as the Jets making flashy signing after flashy signing in 2024, or the Jets making the Rodgers deal in 2023, just as those things don't necessarily result in wins, I don't think we should dismiss or like laugh at the idea that a more sustainable path means that you're waiting forever. I think that's a huge misnomer that's being put out there in the media right now. And it's one that doesn't square with reality, because look, usually pretty quickly whether you have a good coaching staff or not. There are very few exceptions to that. I mean, there's some teams that are just in a total rebuild, teams that are in tank mode where you see that, but the Jets aren't in tank mode. The Jets have a good core for the first time in a really long time. The Jets actually have pieces where if they build around these guys correctly, this could be a very good team. This could be a very tough out in the AFC going forward. So that's the hope. And just because the Rodgers era didn't fail, and I feel like a broken record because this podcast has been on the air since 2016. And I feel like every single year I've said something like things can turn around quickly. And here we are, it's the year 2025, February 14th, 2025. In the history of this podcast, we still haven't had a winning season. But things can turn around quickly. And at some point they will. And you just hope that the Jets have the right people in place. I'm encouraged by the start. Long way to go. Big offseason ahead. Hopefully the Jets make some moves to improve their roster. But I think that there's still, look, maybe I'm just silly about this. I still remain optimistic about what this franchise can be. Hopefully they'll get there. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. If you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. And if you enjoy the show and are listening on the podcast source, give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your weekend, everybody. We'll be back on Monday to talk more Jets.